Okay, good morning. Yesterday afternoon in the job track session, I had the great privilege of spending time with roughly 40 associate executive directors and chief operating officers. They are a remarkable group, and I think, as most of us know, those are the folks who make the wheels turn in JCCs throughout our system. During the course of my conversation with them, I mentioned the fact that we are living and working at a remarkable time which I described as the high point in the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. And that may sound like hyperbole, but in fact, if you give it a moment's thought, you'll notice that since the destruction of the Second Temple, as the Jewish people have wandered the world, exiled from our national homeland, we have lived at the mercy of whichever regime, country, or political leadership in which we found ourselves. And for the better part of those 2,000 years, it has been a dicey proposition at best, and in the worst parts, as recently as the middle of the 20th century, it's been the worst nightmare in the history of humanity. The reason that we live at the high point of Jewish history today is because today we are closing in on the celebration of the 71st birthday of the sovereign, modern, Jewish, democratic state of Israel. Now, I have been working in the Jewish communal world long enough to have spent chapters of my career dealing with all different aspects of Israel and the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jewry. And as I alluded to yesterday, I'm an observer of dynamics in Jewish communal life, and here's what I have been observing in recent years with regard to the topic of the modern state of Israel. People describe it as complicated. People describe the topic as divisive. People describe the topic as risky. And for the most part, these descriptions are a byproduct of the fact that when the topic of Israel comes up, it tends to get people's backs up. It tends to get people's emotions running hot, and it tends to create moments in which people are arguing with one another about things for which they feel a great deal of passion and for which they have very little patience for the contrasting passion of others. That 95% of the time, when the subject of Israel comes up, it comes up in the context of two topics, is the reason why we've begun to describe it that way. And to oversimplify the matter, I would say that when we see or hear about the topic of Israel coming up in our interactions in communities of any kind, wherever we are, it comes up about these two things. We talk about peace or occupation or geopolitics, or we talk about what I'll describe as the kotel, or the divergence between the interests of orthodoxy in Israel and everybody else. So if you're sitting in a synagogue here in the United States that's outside of the Orthodox movement, you are bemoaning the fact that non-Orthodox in Israel have not enough to say about the realities of religious life in the state. And depending on where your politics are on the political spectrum, if the topic comes up and the subject is the geopolitics of Israel, it's too right, it's too left, it's too disinterested in those who are occupied or oppressed or in some way held back. And as a result, we're going to fight and argue to the teeth, as is our wont as a Jewish people, our stiff-necked selves, about what it is we feel is right and righteous, particularly at a time in which here in North America, we are living through a period of hyper desire and determination to be sensitive to the needs, concerns, and issues of others. Now, we're in the community building business, so far be it for us to want to convene conversations that are going to make people's blood boil. We don't want people fighting in the JCC or in our universe. We want them coming together. We want them joining hands around the things for which there is common interest and common devotion and common purpose. And so the reason why we've begun to see Israel as a divisive topic is because people like to argue about it, as if the notion of arguing about Israel was inherently a bad thing, which it isn't. On the other hand, there's an awful lot more to the modern sovereign state of Israel than geopolitics and the question of divisions between the more and less observant in Israeli society and the way they view the more or less observant among us in the diaspora. The Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, in describing the Torah, said that the Torah has 70 faces because the great rabbis of the years gone by had the same problem about the Torah that we have with the modern state of Israel. There was deep discord about which interpretation of the Torah was right, correct, or appropriate. And as a result, after years of deliberation, the great rabbis said that the Torah is such a rich and comprehensive source and resource and guide to life that it has 70 different faces or interpretations, each of which is equally worthy to any other. And that any committed member of the community who doesn't take advantage of the opportunity to view the Torah through multiple of its 70 faces was losing out on the opportunity to understand the greatness that it had to offer. So if we view the Torah as a prism with 70 sides, unless we make a concerted effort to look at it through each of those 70 faces, we are shortchanging ourselves regarding what it has to offer. And so it is with the modern state of Israel. If the modern state of Israel is a modern miracle with 70 faces, then to reduce ourselves to looking at it through only 2 of those faces over and over and over again to a point of great frustration contributes to the modern reality that we're contending with, that people begin to see it as a divisive or problematic topic. It is divisive through those 2 faces. There are things about which we actively disagree, and we should actively disagree. But if we forego the responsibility to see the other 68 faces, then we are missing out on the chance to see, capitalize, and engage with the richness that the modern sovereign Jewish democratic state of Israel has to offer. And if we are going to lead in the strengthening and building and evolution of Jewish life on this continent, then we don't get to choose to look at this particular part of who we are as a Jewish people through only 2 of 70 faces. We have to seek opportunities to see it through many, many more, and to enjoy the extraordinary journey that we will undertake as we begin to discover Israel in ways that we had either overlooked or forgotten or had never imagined. Israel, the innovator, the startup nation. Israel, whose gross domestic product per capita recently surpassed that of Japan. Israel, who turned a dry backwater corner of the Middle East into a water-exporting superpower. Israel, the birthplace of the modern Hebrew language. Israel, the home of the Bible. Israel, the noble, the rescuers of the Vietnamese boat people. Israel, the brave, which has dispatched its military leadership to rescue Jews in need, hostages taken in places in all corners of the globe. Israel, the 2018 Eurovision champion and the host of Eurovision 2019. Israel, the land of medical miracles. Israel, the home of 11 Nobel laureates and 9 Olympic medalists. Israel, the inclusive, a world model for enabling those with disabilities. Israel, the progressive, a leading global advocate for LGBTQ communities. Israel, the good neighbor, providing medical relief to victims of the Syrian civil war. Israel, who on Friday sought to become the 4th nation in the history of the world to land a spacecraft on the moon. And Israel, which last night celebrated the Academy Award given to Israeli director Guy Nativ for Best Live Action Short Film. We need to see more of these faces of Israel, and we need to show these faces to the people in our communities. The reason we are living at the high point of Jewish history is because we now have 70 faces worthy of sustaining and driving the future of the Jewish people. And make no mistake, we do the most important work that's being done in advancing and enriching North American Jewish life. But the Jewish world in which our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will live in will be determined as much or more by what goes on in Israel than by all of the things that we do here. And we are stakeholders in the future of that state. We are stakeholders in the things we like. We are stakeholders in the thing we love. We are stakeholders in the things that we admire. We are stakeholders in the things that drive us crazy. We are stakeholders in questions of religion. We are stakeholders in questions of geopolitics and ethics and morality and righteousness and corruption. We are stakeholders. But if we're going to be active stakeholders, then the worst possible approach we can take is to say, we choose not to discuss, involve, or engage with that topic, certainly not until it's being undertaken in a way that rises to our level of expectations. By removing ourselves from engagement and discussion, we forego the right to be active stakeholders in the future of the Jewish people. And the alternative, the responsible approach that we need to take, is to lean in and do more, and promote engagement, and promote dialogue, and promote exposure, and insist that the people in our community see Israel in the 70 faces of its majesty, even as we continue to contend and contest the issues about which we disagree. And I can tell you something fundamentally true. Almost all of the faces beyond these two that we find so difficult are faces around which we will instill pride and inspiration in the members of our community with regard not just to their enthusiasm for the state of Israel, but their enthusiasm for Jewish life and for the Jewish people. That's the mission. And if we don't like what we're seeing, and it's far from a perfect place, then the more involved and the more engaged and the more committed we are, the more likely we are to have a chance to be part of how it goes from where it is to where we imagine that it's going to be. This is, make no mistake, the high point for the Jewish people since the destruction of the Second Temple. What we do with this moment in Jewish history will define the nature of Jewish life for the Jewish people for centuries to come. We are links in a 4,000-year-old chain. And the links that follow us will only be as strong as we choose to make ours in this particular moment. Israel has 70 faces, and we must ensure that we see as many of them as we can and expose as many of them as we can to the people for whom we bear such great responsibility in our communities across the United States and Canada. This morning, we will be privileged to see Israel through the eyes of two extraordinary faces of Israel and its modern agenda. It is my great privilege to introduce a remarkable young woman born and raised in New Orleans and now making her home in New York, a young woman whose reputation in the world of Israel and Israel advocacy precedes her. She is a writer, a journalist, and a political commentator. My friends, please welcome a remarkable voice and face for Israel, Chloé Valdary.
Good morning. What made the beauty of the moon and the beauty of the sea? Did that beauty make you? Did that beauty make me? Does that make me something? Will I be something? Am I something? This question was first posed in a class when I was 17 years old by a poet named Anis Mojgani. And it is that question that I have pondered ever since. It's that question that I've anchored all of my Israel advocacy through ever since. I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. I grew up in an atypical Christian family. Atypical in the sense that as a Christian, I grew up observing Shabbat and keeping kosher style and keeping all of the holy days. A funny anecdote I like to tell people about this experience is really about Yom Kippur. My understanding is that in the Orthodox tradition, one begins to fast for Yom Kippur around bat mitzvah age, 12, 13 years old, right? Is this true? Yeah, so my parents did not have the rabbinical text to advise them on when they should start making their children fast for Yom Kippur. You see where this is going, yes. And for some reason, in their beautiful infinite wisdom, they decided that 5 years old would be a good time for their kids to start fasting for Yom Kippur. So that is how long I've been fasting for Yom Kippur, since I was 5 years old. And as a result, you can imagine, I became incredibly enamored with Jewish tradition and Jewish culture and Jewish customs. I came across the writings of Leon Uris when I was 15 years old, specifically his books Mila 18 and QB 7, and eventually, of course, his most famous book, Exodus, which was about the reestablishment of the State of Israel and was turned into a motion picture film in the 50s starring Paul Newman. I was even a part of the Hebrew Culture Club in high school. So this began my interest in Israel. I went to the University of New Orleans, and initially I majored in film, but all of that changed in 2012 because anti-Semitism started to resurface in Europe, specifically in places like France, where there were attacks on Jewish synagogues, kosher stores, and other areas. And at the time, I was reading a lot of Elie Wiesel, whose most profound message in my eyes was the fact that we cannot be indifferent in the face of injustice. Indeed, he said that the opposite of love is not hatred, but indifference. And so, in an attempt to try and not be indifferent and not be apathetic, I switched majors from film to international studies and started a student pro-Israel organization on my campus called Allies of Israel, where I did Israel advocacy for 3.5 years. Now, during that time, I learned a lot. I had many successes, some failures, but overall, it was a really important time for growth for me. My friends and I, we hosted a lot of tabling events. We invited speakers to come lecture at our university. We even threw festivals at Tulane University, down the street from my university, where we had Matisyahu be our headliner. But overall, one thing that stuck with me and one thing I learned from my experience of doing Israel advocacy was I had actually started off with the wrong question. You see, I started out asking the question of how to combat anti-Semitism, which is a noble question, a good question, an important one. But that question was totally different from the question of how to actually get people to fall in love with Israelis. You see, the question of combating anti-Semitism is essentially asking the question of how to get people to stop hating. But asking, how do I get young people to fall in love with Israelis, is asking, how do I get people to start loving? And once I shifted my framework, my mindset from asking how to get people to stop hating to how to get people to start loving, everything changed. And from that moment on, I began to think to myself, well, what is it that I actually love deeply about Israeli society? What are 3 things that I love about Israeli society? And the first thing that came to mind was very simple. I love the fact that Israelis are resilient and tenacious. I consult for an Israel education organization called Jerusalem U, and that organization makes films about Israeli society. And one of the films that we made was a film called When the Smoke Clears, which was about Israeli soldiers coming back from war and being rehabilitated after experiencing incredible PTSD. And what I learned during the course of developing this film was that the chief of psychology is considered to be one of the foremost experts in the IDF of treating PTSD. And not only has he used his expertise in Israel, but here in our own country. So you have Israeli experts on treating trauma who are partnering with institutions like USC to help us rehabilitate our own veterans who have come back from war and are experiencing trauma. Not only that, but there's an incredible organization called Natal, which is involved in the inner city here in America, in places like Los Angeles and in Chicago, helping people who have either seen friends and families become victims of gang violence or who themselves have been victims of gang violence, and is helping them rehabilitate and deal with overcoming the trauma that they experience. So I am grateful, indeed, I love the fact that Israelis are resilient. This is not only something to admire, but something that has greatly affected our own society as well. And what's the second thing I love about Israelis? This is also an easy thing to talk about, but I think actually one that we take for granted. I love the fact that Israelis are super into volunteering. Now again, I think this is something we take for granted. In my experience, being in the world of Israel education, we always talk about this incredible phenomenon of tikkun olam, repairing the world. What an incredible virtue in a society. But think about it. Think about how much Israelis are super into volunteering. In a few minutes, you're going to hear from someone who represents an incredible organization called IsraAID, which is often the first on the ground in places that have experienced natural disasters. In fact, it's my understanding that IsraAID is still on the ground today in Puerto Rico, helping that community out after the experience of the storm that hit. Now, I had spent a lot of time speaking in different schools around the country and around the world, talking about this incredible spirit of volunteerism that exists within Israeli society. But I realized that at some point, I had to put my money where my mouth was. And so eventually, inspired by that spirit, I decided to volunteer and get involved in my own local community of Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. So I am proud to say that it's Israelis that actually inspired me to get involved with an incredible organization in Brooklyn called Children of Promise, which mentors kids whose parents are incarcerated. So not only do I love this incredible virtue within Israeli society, I love that it has conjured in me the desire to get up and go do something in my own. Now, what about the last thing that I love about Israeli society? The third thing. Well, before I tell you what that is, I first have to tell you a story about Kendrick Lamar. Random, seemingly, I know. So, after I graduated from the University of New Orleans, I moved to New York. I got a job at the Wall Street Journal, and at the time, I decided to write an 82-page paper on the topic of Israel advocacy and millennials, what works, what doesn't, and how to make it better. All in service of trying to get my generation, again, to learn to love Israeli society. But at the time when I was doing that research, I realized that if I wanted to know how do we get people to love something, I had to ask, well, what are they already in love with? And how do I use that as a conduit? How do I use that to learn from that psychology of connection to create the same thing between millennials and Israeli society? And the biggest source of information on what people love, for me at least, to study from, was pop culture. So at this point in the research, I started shifting gears and started studying pop culture, those influencers, celebrities, companies that command attention. And inevitably, I probed my own interests and came across Kendrick Lamar. And I kept having to ask, what is it about his music that people gravitate toward, that I gravitate toward? Is there anything about his music that can teach me something, specifically about my love for Israeli society? And then I started to clue in and focus on one particular song by Kendrick Lamar, and that song was called DNA. And in that song, Kendrick says something very important. He says, I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA. And what he means when he says that is simply the articulation of the complexity of what it means to be a human being. I, too, Chloe, have power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA. And you do as well. And the essence, the beauty of really what was shown to me from listening and trying to engage with this song was the fact that I and you, and yes, Israelis, are imperfect. And that is actually the third thing that I love about Israeli society. Because in seeing the imperfections of Israeli society and still seeing Israelis wrestle with that, try to be better and do better, I am able to see my own imperfections and also strive to do better and be better. And when I think about this, I am reminded of the late, great author Amos Oz, who wrote beautifully with incredible prose about the imperfections of Israeli society. In his autobiography, A Tale of Love and Darkness, and in other books as well, like In the Land of Israel, this is a collection of his essays. And so this thing that is often displayed in sharp relief in the media, the imperfections, oftentimes creates a caricature of Israeli society. But when put in context, I am able to be reminded of myself and my own potential, despite those imperfections, even as I see those within Israel. I was recently reading an article in Tablet magazine, to this point, about how recently the Israeli government realized that it needed to invest more in the Arab, Druze, and Circassian minority within Israeli society. So, to the extent that they could, they've been allocating a lot of money toward this, and this has contributed to the creation of what's called Silicon Wadi, which is essentially the Silicon Valley of Tel Aviv, in which many Arab citizens are increasingly getting involved in the tech sector, two of whom are on the screen behind me. And I thought, how incredible that despite this constant talk in the media and online of imperfection within Israeli society, Israelis themselves are still working and striving to do better and to aspire to greater things. So I began this talk by asking a question, that question posed by the poet Anis Mojgani. What made the beauty of the moon and the beauty of the sea? Did that beauty make you? Did that beauty make me? Does that make me something? Will I be something? Am I something? And the answer comes, I always was, I am, and I still have time to be. And as it is true of Israeli society, it is true for you, and it is true for me as well. Thank you.
It's a remarkable thing how things that we have an initial reflexive perception about are a function of the way in which we choose to capture and characterize the very same things from a fundamentally different point of view. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking again the remarkable Chloé Valdary. The next face of Israel has become something of a personal matter for me over the course of a little bit more than a year. A number of people in this room know that I lost my father at the end of January. And in many respects, my dad was the guiding light of my life. The passion of his life, having been born in the 1920s and having lived through the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust and those dicey moments between the end of the Shoah and the miraculous establishment of the modern state of Israel, set him on a path throughout his entire life in which it was imperative that the narrative about the reality of the modern Jewish experience and the modern state of Israel be accurately portrayed. And it was imperative that every opportunity be found to help people to find the beauty in this heroic redemption of the Jewish people after 2,000 years of precarious existence. My dad went to synagogue in the fall of 2017 and heard a speaker from an organization called IsraAID. And when I came to dinner with my family at my parents' home, as we do and did on every Friday night, my dad said, I have to tell you the story of this organization that I'd never heard of before. And he was brimming with excitement and enthusiasm. And he proceeded to tell me that this non-governmental organization is the first feet on the ground after disasters that have struck everywhere and anywhere across the globe, dressed in blue and white and representing the state of Israel as those who respond to the call when the chips are down. And he told me that I have to find the guy that spoke at the synagogue. I had to meet him, and I had to figure out a way to make sure that his message was going to be heard. And as I always said when my father told me to do something, I was like, yes, Dad, I'll take care of that right away. But, you know, the weeks passed, and I hadn't gotten around to that meeting. And every time I came to dinner on Friday night, my father said, so what's the story? Did you find that guy from IsraAID yet? And I said, I haven't found him. I've been traveling. I have this new job. I'm very busy. That wasn't going over well at all. So finally, I decided to concede the point. I reached out to the guy, Yotam, and we arranged to get together in New York, and I met him, and I was dazzled and entirely captivated. And I immediately thought, this is a guy we need to bring to the forthcoming biennial in Memphis, Tennessee, because the hundreds of lay leaders and staff who are going to be coming to our big event need to hear this story. And I proudly went to Shabbat dinner at my parents' house that Friday night, and I said, Dad, you'll be happy to hear. I met him, he's terrific, and we're bringing him to the biennial in Memphis. And he said to me, that sounds great. When is the biennial in Memphis? And I said, it's in May of 2018, in about 6 months. And he looked at me like this. 6 months. What are you going to be doing between now and then? So I was thrilled, actually, when we unveiled our partnership with IsraAID and its remarkable co-CEO, Yotam Polizer, at the Memphis Biennial in May. And we at JCC Association and across the field have been remarkably proud to say that we're connected to one of the most remarkable and extraordinary organizations of giving, support, and volunteerism, representing the best of one of the great faces of the State of Israel. My now dear friend, Yotam Polizer, was IsraAID's country director in Japan after the devastating earthquake and tsunami that was such a disaster for the nation and people of Japan. He lived and worked there for 3 years. He spent 3.5 years in Nepal in the aftermath of natural disaster there. He is a tireless globetrotter, leader and promoter of the extraordinary work of IsraAID. My friends, it is a great honor for me to introduce my friend and my father's guiding star on the subject of this wonderful face of Israel, Yotam Polizer.
Wow. Shalom, everyone. Boker Tov, good morning. I wish my mother was here to hear that. Well, next time I invite her. A funny story, I met Doron, I think, 3 times over the last 2 weeks, and it's mostly on flights. So it's nice to meet you on the ground here. Thank you so much for being a friend, a partner, and a mentor. Thank you, Doron. Thank you. And thank you, Chloé. We need so many friends and partners like you. So I'll start with sharing my own personal story. I grew up in this tiny moshav in the north part of Israel, near Tzfat. It's called Harashim. You never heard of it. Don't worry, Israeli people don't know it either. We're famous for being the rainiest place in Israel, and that doesn't mean too much, as you can imagine. It's probably around the same rain as we get in LA. And I never thought that I'm going to get involved in any kind of humanitarian work. But before my military service, I joined a program that very few people, I think, know about in the States. It's called Shnat Shirut, stands for service year. And this weird phenomenon that about 10,000 Israelis every year decide that 3 years in the army or 2 years for female is not enough. And we decided to take another year for service. And I did my year of service working mainly with Ethiopian Jews near Netanya. And that year changed my life because it made me passionate not only about service, but also about building bridges between different cultures. And in my army service, I also did something quite unusual. I was a combatant for about 1.5 years. And for 1.5 years in the Nahal unit, I was actually leading an educational project to help Bedouin Muslim children in the south part of Israel, teaching them Hebrew and English and helping them integrate into the Israeli society. And that's, again, another step where I really developed a passion for building bridges. And then after the army, I did what a lot of Israelis do. I followed the hummus trail. And I'm sure you all heard about this weird story of about 50,000 Israelis every year going to India or to South America. People who had less money go to India, so I went to India. And the reason it's called the hummus trail is because the local Indians along the route, they started to open restaurants and serve hummus. And the hummus is not highly recommended. It's a little bit curry-ish. But it was a great experience. And after India, I went to Nepal. And I wanted to do a trek in the Himalaya. And I was with a friend who was just released from Sayeret Matkal, from the Matkal Commando Unit. And we did a 21-day trek in 9 days. And I wasn't, I wasn't into running. I really wanted to see the view, to meet the people. But he was just about getting up at the top of the mountain and getting off. And I have to thank him, because that's the reason I'm here today with you. Because as soon as we got off the mountain and we reached the capital of Kathmandu, I saw a small poster in Chabad House. And by the way, a very random piece of information, the biggest seder in the world is in Nepal. I don't know if you knew that. It's a true story. About 2,000 Israelis and Jews get together on Pesach for the seder in Nepal, in Bet Chabad. I don't know if I highly recommend that experience, but I've been there too. But anyway, I was seeing this poster that invited people to volunteer with street children in Nepal. And I thought, that sounds cool. I'll do it for 2 hours, and I'll continue to Thailand or wherever I was going. That 2 hours turned into 3.5 years. And I was working with street children. I was also working part-time for the Israeli embassy. And I learned a very useful language, Nepalese. I actually didn't think it would be useful, but it proved to be extremely useful after the earthquake in 2015. But then after 3 years in Nepal, 3.5 years in Nepal, I was finally ready to go back home to Israel and start my life. But then that thing happened, the tsunami in Japan. And I was offered to lead a relief mission for 2 weeks. And I thought, why not? I always loved sushi. So let's go to Japan. And I found myself 4 days after the tsunami, and I took this picture. And this is a town near Fukushima that was devastated by a 120-foot wave of tsunami. Just to remind all of you, about 20,000 people lost their lives, and 500,000 people lost their home. And in case you are wondering, this boat was not originally parking there. And by the way, I apologize in advance. My way of coping with the stress is a lot of Jewish and Israeli humor. So, but just a question: where do you even start from in this level of devastation? What do you do? And Doron was mentioning before Japan. So Japan actually is very well organized in terms of cleaning efforts, medical support. And in fact, I don't have that picture with me, but 3 months later, after this tsunami, this whole area was clean, with the exception of the boat that was still there. But what they didn't have, and unfortunately in Israel we have a lot, and Chloé spoke about it beautifully, is expertise in the field of trauma. So we started a program that's still going on right now, 8 years after the tsunami, to provide trauma support for children in Japan affected by the tsunami. And we trained about 3,000 community workers and teachers and social workers in Japan to help children cope with trauma. After 3 years in Japan, another disaster hit the same kind of neighborhood, the Philippines, the typhoon in the Philippines in 2013. So I led a relief mission there. And then in 2014, one of the worst epidemics, the Ebola outbreak, devastated West Africa and threatened the whole world. And I'm sure you all remember this world panic. So when everyone was running away, I found myself on a plane to Sierra Leone, and I spent about a year there. And another very important piece of information is that my dream was always to have my own private jet, but I didn't have the money, so I decided to go to all these places that people are running away from. So in Japan, it was the radiation that people were running away from in Fukushima. In the Ebola, it was this unbelievable outbreak, and I spent about a year in Sierra Leone. And when things was finally under control, again, another disaster hit a part of the world that I knew very well, the earthquake in Nepal in 2015. And Nepal was really like a second home to me. As I told you, I spoke Nepalese. And I found myself there in less than 36 hours after the earthquake. But as soon after I landed, there was a second earthquake, what we call an aftershock. And that aftershock, thank God I wasn't injured or anything like that, but it was a big problem because the airport was shut down. So I was there by myself in this unbelievable devastation, and I had a search and rescue team, really the top rescuers in Israel, waiting to deploy, but they were stuck in the airport because they couldn't make it to Nepal. And they only arrived in the morning of the 4th day, which was really late because We'll talk about it later in the J-response session, but when we talk about search and rescue efforts, the first 72 hours are the most critical. The chances of finding anyone beyond that point is almost impossible. But we decided to give it a shot anyway, and I spoke to the chief of the Nepalese army, and he pointed out this one building that you see in the picture. According to his sources, there were still 22 people buried under the rubble. 22 people. We had 2 civil engineers in our team, and they drilled in, and we started to pull out some people, but unfortunately, we couldn't find anyone alive. So in the first day of our operation, we pulled out 12 dead bodies. In the second day, we pulled an additional 9. So a total of 21 people, but we were still missing 1 person. We heard there were 22 people missing. So I thought maybe they miscalculated, so I asked in Nepalese, I asked the local community if there was anyone they couldn't recognize. And they told me there was one lady. Her name was Krishna. She had 2 children. She was 35 years old, and she's the only person they couldn't recognize. So we decided to keep drilling. And in the morning of the 6th day, about 130 hours after the earthquake, we were able to dig about 15 meters deep into this hole that you see here. And we used a special life detector. What's a life detector? It's a very sensitive microphone that could recognize very subtle vibrations such as heartbeats and human breath. And the commander of our team was listening with these massive headphones, and he told me he hears something. He said he wasn't sure. It could be a cat. It could be some bricks moving, but it could actually be this last person who may have survived. And then he asked me to do something really weird. He knew I spoke the language, so he asked if I could crawl into this pile of rubble and scream something in Nepalese. Again, not because he thought this person would answer, but he thought that might trigger some sort of reaction, something that would help us locate her into this big pile of rubble. And of course, I was terrified because I knew that if I moved my hand in the wrong direction, the whole thing could collapse not only on me, but on the rescue team behind me and potentially this last survivor. So when I reached the deepest point, I screamed something. And I'll share it with you. Apologize that it may sound like gibberish. It goes like, Yaha Koko Unhuncha. Yaha Koko Unhuncha. So it's a bit of a funny story, actually. I was sharing this story. We're doing a lot of campus events here in the States. And I was sharing this story at Harvard in Boston a couple of months ago. And one of the students started laughing. All the other students looked at her. Why are you laughing on such a dramatic story? And she was Nepalese. So she understood what I was saying. And the reason she was laughing was because what I wanted to say was, is there anybody in there? But I was so overwhelmed with the situation, so I ended up saying something like, excuse me, is there anybody in there? It was completely inappropriate for this situation. But really, unbelievably, down from the rubble, not only that we were able to recognize the movement, but this lady who survived for 6 days without food or water was able to make a sound, a voice. And she was whispering the word Dukcha. Dukcha in English means it hurts, I'm in pain. So after a very long operation, we were able to pull her out. And after 2 months of treatment, that's how she looked. Thank you. And that's actually how she looked today, when she's back with her children. After the situation in Nepal was a bit better, and we're still working in Nepal, but I had to move to probably one of the worst humanitarian crises of our time, the Syrian refugee crisis. And we worked with the Syrians in Jordan, and we also worked a little bit with the IDF on the border of the Golan, but our main work was in Greece, in the island of Lesbos. And in this small island, we had 5,000 to 7,000 refugees arriving every day from August 2015. And they were coming on these rubber boats that was supposed to originally carry maybe 30 people each, but I actually seen 150 people on boats. 150 people, men, women, children, disabled. The oldest person I met was a 94-year-old Syrian lady. What makes a 94-year-old lady leave everything she have and go on this crazy journey. And I can talk for hours about the refugee crisis, but I actually don't call it the refugee crisis. We call it in IsraAID, we call it the refugee opportunity. Because think about it. These are people coming from Syria, also from Iraq, Afghanistan, and recently we've seen quite a few refugees from Iran. All of these are people that never seen a Jewish person in their life, let alone an Israeli person. And then the first people they see when they reach the coast of Greece are this group of Israelis. And as you see in this image, our Israeli identity is quite visible, right? We have this big Star of David. So we always joke that they probably think they took the wrong boat. They probably think they ended up in Tel Aviv. But it's even more interesting because this guy in the picture and about half of our team members are Arab Israelis. So they speak Arabic. And we recruited them because we needed Arabic speakers. So these refugees arrive, they see Israeli people, they're in shock, they think they took the wrong boat, and then these Israeli people speak to them in their own mother language, in Arabic, and provide them with medical support. So it's a very, very confusing experience, but it's a great opportunity, not only to save lives, but to build bridges and to change people's perspective. And one of the stories that I personally had in Greece was one day we received a message on WhatsApp. We all work on WhatsApp. That's how we coordinate our response. And in fact, we've seen that all the refugees also use WhatsApp. We received a message that a boat capsized. A boat capsized just before it reached the shore. Thank God that day, unlike other days where we weren't so lucky, we were able to pull everyone out. And I was carrying this cute little girl. I think she's about 4 or 5 years old. And I'm not a doctor, but half of her body was in the water, and she was literally shivering and shaking my hands. And I can see that she's suffering from severe hypothermia. So I handed her over to our doctors, and they treated her. And after a few hours, she was OK. She survived. Her father stood there. He was OK because he was able to pull himself out, but he could not say a word. He just kept looking at me. And when he finally opened his mouth, he spoke fluent English, which was a surprise. Apparently, he was a very educated guy, an engineer from Damascus. And the first thing he said when he opened his mouth was the following. He said, "My worst enemy became my biggest supporter. And the people who are supposed to protect me back home in Syria are chasing me away." And again, to me, it was the first time that I realized what an opportunity we have through this terrible tragedy that's still ongoing today, even though we don't hear about it in the news, to not only save lives, but to really build these unbelievable bridges. I'm going to skip a little bit forward to this part of the world, because we're not only operating in Syria or in the Ebola or in Nepal, we actually have a lot of operations here in the US. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons we're so excited about J-Response. So it started for us in Houston last summer, summer of 2017. We sent a team of disaster responders to Houston from Israel. And then a week after, we sent another team to Florida, to Hurricane Irma. And then a week after, and it was literally week after week after week, if you remember the summer of 2017, there was an earthquake in Mexico. So we sent a team of Spanish-speaking therapists and psychologists to Mexico. And then a week after, probably the worst disaster of that period was Hurricane Maria, that devastated Puerto Rico. And we didn't have any more teams to send. But we still had a team in Haiti since the earthquake in 2010. And so we sent a team of Israeli and Haitians to Puerto Rico. We had to hire our own plane. And we distributed these water filters because people didn't have access to clean water. And Chloe was mentioning it before. We are still in Puerto Rico. And I was just there 3 weeks ago because we built a water filtration system for the community. Again, our goal is not just to respond. But what happens, unfortunately, in these disasters is that in the first 2 weeks is what I cynically call the aid festival. You know, the media is there, everyone's sending supplies, volunteers. After 2 weeks, 90% of the supplies and the donations and the volunteers and the media are gone. And the local communities are re-traumatized because they're abandoned. So for us, it's important not only to be the first on the ground, but actually to stay there when the cameras move on. And that's what we're doing in Puerto Rico. And in Houston, we stayed for 6 months. And we're also working in California now, following the fires, the wildfires, in Paradise, and in many parts of the world. Last story I want to share with you today, before we kind of move forward and we have a lot of session and a lot of time to discuss, is about this guy. We actually work in Germany. And you may think, why would Germany need a support? But they actually received more than 1 million refugees. And one day I got a phone call from this guy in the picture, and he didn't seem so young. And I asked him, what's the story? He said, my name is Gerard. I was a Holocaust survivor. I'm 82 years old, and I heard how you work with the refugees, and I want to help. I said, great, but what do you want to do? He said, I don't care. I want to mentor these kids. I want to teach them about the history. I want to teach them English and German, and I want to help them integrate in the society. And I said, great, but you have to go for a training. So he actually went for a training with Lior, who is our social worker, who's only 50 years younger than him. And since then, he comes every week to volunteer with the refugees as part of our team. And one of the most incredible moments that I had was when we took a team of refugees, Syrian refugees, with Gerard to the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. They never heard about the Holocaust. It's not part of the educational system in Syria, unfortunately. But when they heard the story of Gerard, when they saw that, we were all in tears. It was a big Jewish soap opera. But it was so incredible to see. And really, I realized that our goal, and this is what we're trying to do here, is to save lives, to change lives, and to build bridges. And this is what we're hoping to do with all of you together and with all the JCCs in the country. And as Doron mentioned, for us, it's very important that more people will hear this story. But it's not only about exposure and education. What makes me so excited about this partnership with JCC Association and J-Response is the possibility we have to jointly deploy to disasters in the US and globally. And that's what we're trying to do right now in the US. We're trying to train more Americans to join Israelis on that missions, to help respond to local disasters, and to work together to save lives, change lives, and build bridges. Toda. Thank you.